Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Beverly Hills Bar Association Mediation Section's presentation on implicit bias in employment, a historical perspective, with Dr. Lenton Aikins. My name is Glenn Gottlieb. I'm the chair of the mediation section, and with my co-chair and program sub-chair, Adam Porter. Just want to welcome everybody to the program. You should have received the program materials in an email that was sent to you maybe about an hour ago or so by the Beverly Hills Bar. So if you want to refer to those materials either during or after the program, if you did not receive those, please send the bar an email so that we can get those sent out to you. I want to make a quick pitch on behalf of the mediation section. We've been reorganizing and revitalizing the section for the last couple of years. And we now got a very thriving and dynamic community, including an approved mediator panel, which is a screened panel, actually. It's not just a referral service where anybody can get their name on the service. We have a subcommittee headed by Shane Sageb, who screens our applicants to the committee. They all have to have levels of experience and background to be able to be part of our panel, and generally subject matter area. We cap our fees at $400 an hour, and 10% of the fees that are generated go back to the Beverly Hills Bar Association. So we hope that you'll consider, if you have a need for mediation in the future, take a look at the folks that are on our approved mediator panel, or contact any of us that are part of the section. We'd be happy to promote that. So today's program on implicit bias is under the auspices of the mediation section. Dr. Lenton Aikins, Lenton, is a member of our executive committee that I chair, a newly elected member and active participant. He is a full-time mediator in the Los Angeles area. He mediates primarily in the employment law area and throughout Southern California. As part of his background, he's been an assistant professor in the Cal State University system. He was a dean at a community college, charter president of the Academic Booster Club at Edison High School in Huntington Beach. Thank you for your service to the educational community. Founder of the academic booster movement in general in California. He's been a real estate broker, owner of a couple of real estate offices in Orange County. He's done a whole lot of stuff. In his practice from 1991 through 2016, in his legal practice, he generally litigated employment issues, suing many public and private entities in the discrimination area, including sexual harassment, police misconduct, other discriminatory practices, and so forth. So he's highly qualified to speak in this particular area. He tried over 25 cases during his practice, including 3 that established new law on appeal. So I've considered, when I step down as mediation chair, he's going to be one of the first people that I think of to replace me. Obviously, his qualifications run long and deep, particularly in this area of bias. So Lenton, without further comment, I'm going to pass this along. In terms of housekeeping, this program is an hour and a half long. We're going to leave about the last 15 or 20 minutes for your questions. If you do have questions, you'll see at the bottom of your screen, there's a Q&A area where you can just click on that box. It'll bring up a dialog box where you can type in your question. I'm going to moderate those for the end of the program. Also, if you have any comments that you'd like to add, the chat function is also open to you, and you can decide whether to make a comment to the entire group or particularly to myself or Dr. Aikins. We just got a question. Are there any materials that you should have? Yes, I may have come in a little bit late. For those who did, you should have gotten the materials via email from the Beverly Hills Bar. And if you didn't get them in there, Alex is also putting a link into the chat box there. So you have both the link, you should have an email. If for any reason you have difficulty accessing those, then just contact the Bar Association and they'll get you a copy. But Dr. Aikins will also be sharing the screen with his slide presentation, so you can follow along without having to split your screen. So I've ended my comments. Unless you think I'm missing anything, Lenton, I'm going to let you take it from here.
Well, thank you so much. I didn't deserve those complimentary accolades, but I'll take them because we need all we can get. Good morning, everybody. This is approximately an hour and a half or 2 hour presentation, and let me just say a few words about the program today. Excuse me. We will cover basically a definition of implicit bias, the objectives of the lecture, how implicit bias gets translated into action or inaction. We'll say a few words about the scientific basis, and we'll just click through the slides. So thank you so much for coming today. And Glenn has given a rather overgenerous presentation of what we're doing here, especially of me. So I'm going to get going without any further ado. Okay, how implicit bias works. Implicit bias is like something you don't understand that you have. It's unconscious bias that you don't even know you have. And it's like whispering voices, inner voices to you that you don't really realize. And what we're concerned with is the harmful inner voices whispering. We're not concerned with some of the overall arching of implicit bias, because implicit bias, you probably have heard presentations of it, and people try to soften it, over define it by saying, well, we have implicit bias, because otherwise we couldn't go through a door without assuming that it's going to open a certain way. Our implicit bias, and you're implicitly biased, and you don't even know it because you favor the color blue. I'm concerned with the harmful inner voices that whisper into people's unconsciousness and cause behavior that they're unaware of. And implicit bias is the bias you don't even know you have. And so I'll be discussing that. My major concern is trying to put a number on it, or trying to put a handle on implicit bias. Kind of like, I think Beyonce has a song, if you like it, I'm a single girl, if you like it, put a ring on it. And that's what I'm trying to do with implicit bias. I've done a good deal of research on the areas, and if anyone wants me to send them a brief bibliography of some of the cases, I would be happy to do that. If you just send me a note, you can go to my website, which is www.aikinsmediation.com, or you can just Google me and my name will come up, and you can send me an email that way. So we're talking about the harmful thoughts that you don't even know you have. For example, your inner voice could tell you that I don't want to be around certain people, Asians, Hispanic, Blacks, all whites. And it's your inner voice could tell you that you think certain races are inferior, certain people are inferior or superior. Those are the kind of things that implicit bias addresses and should address. Here are the objectives we have. You will be able to, at the end of this program, hopefully identify what implicit bias is, recognize how you, your colleagues, and organization can be negatively affected by implicit bias, and hopefully you'll be able to manage your implicit bias as best you can, and to try to discover it by identifying your conduct. Let me say that implicit bias, if you are treating people differently overtly, that's conscious bias. If you are treating people differently and not even knowing it, that's probably implicit bias. So we'll say a few words about implicit bias in the workplace. Okay, how do we define implicit bias? Implicit bias refers to the unconscious manner in the way our attitudes, our stereotypes affect our actions and informs our decisions. So it's the bias that you don't know you have, plus it's totally subconscious. All right, how do we know this? Well, in 1995 and thereafter, a couple of researchers, one at Harvard University and one at the University of Virginia, defined the term and also later developed a test by which you can measure your implicit bias, become aware that you have it. I'll give you the sites for those later. Okay, how does it become effective? Okay, implicit bias. Now, there was a test, and I'm sure many of you are aware of it, where researchers sent out 5,000 resumes based upon want ads or help wanted ads in 2 papers in 2 cities. I think it was Boston and Chicago. And they used the identical resumes for what was denominated white and black names. The white names were Emily and Greg, and the black names were Lakeisha and Jamal. Otherwise, the resumes were equally distributed, and they were identical except the names. And they wanted to test to see how employers would react implicitly to the names. And they found that resumes with the white names, Emily and Greg, were more acceptable than for callbacks on interviews than Lakeisha and Jamal. In fact, if you are using black names, you'd have to send out 15 resumes to get one call, one interview. If you were white and sending out the identical resumes, you'd only have to send out 10 to get a call back. And there were other indices. The most surprising finding was discrimination was uniform across all occupations and, surprisingly, with government entities. You tend to think of government entities as being a little more fair. They didn't find that the government entities were any more fair. You got to be dangerous when you do these kind of surveys, because the fact that they were so skewed in favor of white names, there are some factors that may attenuate that. Of course, you have a situation where people may look at names and say that, based upon my experience, I've had bad luck with these kind of people, so I don't want to be bothered. And that would, I guess, be a manifestation of overt racism or conscious bias. But the people that reacted to the employers that reacted by simply, okay, we'll take Emily and Greg over Lakeisha and Jamal, not knowing, or not even being conscious of that fact that they were doing so subconsciously because they associated Lakeisha and Jamal with Black people or black names. So also they had another part of the resumes, another section. You can find out more than one thing in surveys, and they sent out some of the resumes where they were good resumes with whites, good resumes with blacks, but the resumes with whites got a more favorable response, 30% more callbacks than the resumes with blacks. In other words, a good resume would help you if you were white, but if you're black, a good resume would make virtually no difference at all. So that was kind of a different finding that they found. Also, there have been audit studies, and then there have been active studies. There have been, of course, field studies. The name study is denominated just a field study, but an audit study is where you take a few people and you do what you can with those. And that was one. This was a study of sex discrimination in hiring in Philadelphia. They sent out resumes to 65 restaurants, and what they were trying to find out was whether men and women would be hired equally in upper class restaurants and lower class restaurants. And what they found was that there were 130 attempts, and they had sent out 12, and here are the offers they got. They got 12 offers to hire restaurants, and 10 of them were for men. So in higher restaurants, and higher restaurants mean more upscale restaurant where you get better tips. There were 12 offers to hire people, and 10 of them were to men and 2 to women. In the lower class restaurants, the fast food restaurants, it was just the opposite. There were 11 offers, and 9 of them were for women. So I suspect also you have to be careful when you're looking at this, because this is Philadelphia, this is back east. People tend to dress for restaurants, they tend to be a little more segmented. In California, I find it difficult to think that you get the same results. But I don't know, I haven't conducted the survey. The people that did so, presumably you can see the footnotes there. And if you have a question, you can send me an email. Implicit bias has also been found to pigeonhole women and also, of course, minorities. But there were studies done on women. And by the way, usually when people are prejudiced, it kind of goes across the spectrum. People who are really prejudiced against blacks tend to be more prejudiced against women. Same way with people who are prejudiced against Jews, tend to be more prejudiced against blacks. It's kind of a spectrum. So this information that researchers have found, they do research on women and blacks particularly, but it kind of goes across. So I don't want you to think that certain other folks are not discriminated against, like Latinos, for example. They're also discriminated against. So in implicit bias, they found that when you have an office setting, there are kind of roles for women Now, this may not be as true in law, but it certainly is true in medicine and some other areas other than law. I think in law, we're becoming a little more awakened to this kind of stuff. But in office settings, there's something called office housework. And that is that women will make the coffee. Women will serve on committees. They're expected to do the work, take over the work, and help out committees more. Also, there's something called emotional office work, where women are labeled by certain names just by being in the office and trying to be equal. And they're often judged more. And I think this is probably true even in California, where we think we're awakened. Number 4, I think more often judged on their appearance, their clothing, their makeup. I really think that is still happening in California and all over the United States. I don't know about the world, but certainly in the United States. And it may not be happening overtly, but there are whispers about the way people are dressing. And it's usually, my experience has been, it's usually about women more than men. That may not be true, but that's what the researchers have also found. Also, women are generally talked over more at meetings. They're interrupted in meetings more. Also, I've noticed this, especially also for Blacks. When they're trying to present an idea, sometimes women are ignored. And later on, a man will come with the same ideas and be the ideas will be credited to him. And women are less likely to get credit for doing group projects. I have footnotes. I'll send them to you if you want me to. This is kind of embarrassing to even talk about this, really, because it is so obvious that implicit bias has an effect on how these things are done or not done. The footnotes. Okay, the part I like most about implicit bias is, and I'll give a critique of it at the end, but the part I like most about it is that there are studies where you can actually put your finger on what's going on. In 1969, a couple of Black guys sued the New York Philharmonic because it wouldn't even hire Blacks on a substitution basis. And they sued successfully, and Leonard Bernstein, who was the conductor, assisted them because he recognized and realized that they were being discriminated against. And the Blacks wanted the demonstration of the musical performance, interviews, we call them interviews, where you perform and you are judged whether or not you are competent to be in the orchestra. They wanted them put behind a screen and camouflage so you can see their color. Well, they won that one, and nothing else happened for a few years. And then the women got word of this, and they start to pressuring the major philharmonics orchestras to hire them, and they wanted to use the same procedure for the interview, which is, of course, the musical demonstration. And they did so, and they found out there was a remarkable increase. Beginning in 1979, I think fewer than 10% of the major symphonic orchestras in the United States had women. Had fewer than, let me say that again. The major Philharmonic Associations orchestras in the United States had fewer than 10% women. And so they started the process. This was imposed kind of on the major symphonic orchestras. And they started the process. And what happened? In 1970, you'll see these statistics are in this report. This was an actual where the researchers went back and took a look at what was happening. They audited the hiring and the firing or whatever. And in 1970, as I said, fewer than 10%, fewer than the 10% of the women of the orchestra had women. They instituted the process in about 1978, 79. About 1997, all of the major symphonic orchestras had over 30% women. And what they did, the major symphonic orchestras, there were 5 of them, you know them: New York Phil, Philadelphia, Chicago, Boston, and I may have missed one. And then you have about 10 others like LA, Pittsburgh, a few others that are kind of second tier. They're not the major, they're not the big 5. So, but all of the big 5 had over 30% in the late 90s, and some of them were approaching 50%. Now, I think all of the major orchestras have about, some of them have more than half, 50% women. And this was done by way of a double-blind, double-blind auditions. What they would have is the graders on one side of the curtain and the women on the other side, so neither one could see the other. It's called double-blind auditions. And they went so far after this process got started. It started to yield better results for the women. And then they went so far as to put down carpet strips where the women, when they were coming in to be auditioned, you couldn't tell by the click of the heel on the hardwood floor whether it was women or men. So they totally blinded it. So, and the results were just phenomenal. So implicit bias kept women out of the major orchestras until way up in the end of the century. I wanted to quote, there was a famous quote, and I'll keep looking for it and see if I can find it. But the director of the Los Angeles Symphonic was a guy by the name of Zubin Mehta. You probably heard of him. He was very famous. And his attitude kind of reflected how men felt about women being in symphonic orchestras. He said this, and I quote, "They, of course being women, they become men. Men treat them as equals. They even change their pants in front of them. I think it's a terrible thing, and I just don't think women should be in an orchestra." I'm not taking anything away from Zubin, but that's what he said. Okay, now this is my second favorite thing about looking at implicit bias. There have been doctrines that have been developed by the courts, particularly the federal courts, that limited plaintiffs' access to the courts by imposing higher pleading standards. They're called gatekeeping cases. A couple of things I just want to point out before mentioning them. The doctrines that are developed by courts, some people call it judicial legislation, are very influential in litigation. They're more influential than just in the federal courts, because the federal courts handle about 15% of all the discrimination and the racial discrimination and things like that in the United States. But that really is an undercount, because a lot of cases, state cases, are ported over to the federal courts. So the 14, I think it's 14.7%, does not reflect the enormous effect that the Supreme Court and other federal courts have on litigation and litigation standards. There are a couple of cases that have been looked at, and where the pleading burden for plaintiffs was really raised. And I have one is Bell Atlantic versus Twombly. You probably heard of that one. In employment cases, this has been terrible for plaintiffs because the standards where you can no longer have notice pleading. Primarily, you have to show more than just a supposition. So if you want to read this case, it's the Bell Atlantic case was the one that really shut the door on hundreds, if not thousands, of plaintiff employment cases. They're called pleading standards and gatekeeping cases, as I said. And these cases basically say that the courts can use common sense, and then, facts must be pled, not possibility, but plausibility. Plausibility. Facts must be pled. Plausibility, not possibility. So that's very important. If you handle these cases, you may want to look at, if you handle employment cases, you just have to look at these cases. So in Twombly case was in, I believe, late 1902nd. Twombly case was in 207, yeah. And then another case came forward, Ashcroft versus Iqbal. And that was a case that really shut the door even more tightly. As a matter of fact, if you read Twombly, Breyer was snookered into writing the majority opinion on that, and he realized he'd made a big mistake when he got to Ashcroft, because he didn't think it would be Twombly was a section 10B1 or whatever it is. I don't do it as securities, but it was on securities or something. Ashcroft, of course, versus Iqbal was, of course, with Attorney General Ashcroft, and it was, I think, Iqbal must have been in Guantanamo, maybe in the United States somewhere. I forget. It's been a while. So, but anyway, Breyer dissented in that case because he thought that the majority of wanted simply to restrict security cases and impose a higher pleading standard on them, but the majority really had other things in mind, and he found out about it when he got to Ashcroft, because they slammed the door on the total pleading in the federal court, and notice pleading went out the window, which had been the practice for I think 50-some years. Okay, there are the Supreme Court and other courts have imposed certain implicit bias standards, and the major one that you probably have heard about is stray remarks. The first female justice of the United States, Sandra Day O'Connor, uttered those remarks in a case called Price Waterhouse versus Hopkins. In that case, Hopkins wanted to be a partner at Price Waterhouse. Price Waterhouse had, I think, 660 some partners. I think 7 of them were women, I believe. But Hopkins applied to be a partner, and she was the only one among her group that applied that year. And the year she applied, she didn't make it. But they put her on a suspension list where she could come back next year without making a formal application, I believe. And so she did come back the next year, and it resulted in her being denied to be a partner. And in that case, Sandra Day O'Connor made the stray remarks, which became a doctrine or a presumption to keep plaintiff cases out of the court. Interesting what happened. If you you may not remember this case, but if you read it, I'm sure you probably remembered it better than I do. But the plaintiff was described as aggressive, foul-mouthed, demanding, and impatient with other staff members by associates being, of course, men. And then during her evaluation, when she came back the second year, she wanted to know, she went to her partner, she said, what happened, why? And one of them said, well, you needed a course in charm school. By the way, this is in the case, it's right in the case. If you want to read the case, you can read it. And also the major guy, I think in her section was Thomas Bayer, and he told her what she needed to do to increase her chances to be promoted. She should walk more femininely, talk more femininely, dress more femininely. Okay, so there's nothing I can say about that. In Justice Sandra Day O'Connor's remarks, here they are, where she said that basically sexual harassment or discrimination cannot be based upon remarks made by non-decision makers and statements by, not even statements by decision makers that were not in her line of supervision. Of course, in California, we don't pay that attention anymore. That's long gone. By the way, these doctrines are called historical because most of them, I think only one is still quasi-active in the federal courts in California. Stray remarks have been taken away, but the harm that they did was immense as far as keeping cases out, whether or not, I don't care which side you're on, you would have to almost admit it. There was an article written in a law journal by Carrie Lynn Stone, who's an expert in this area. And what she did is she looked at all of the stray remarks made in cases to keep plaintiff cases out from 1989, when it was first uttered by Sandra Day O'Connor, and she tracked those remarks in Westlaw. She used Westlaw database, and she tracked those remarks up through 2010. In 1989, there were only 6 citations of stray remarks. In 2010, there were 204. So she traced them every year thereafter, and I'll quote this because it's so remarkable. It's called Carrie, K-E-R-R-I, Lynn Stone, Taking in Strays, a critique of the stray comment doctrine. And it's in 77 Missouri Law Review, 2012. So she tracked the stray remarks doctrine. I call it a doctrine, you can call it an inference or whatever. I think it was a doctrine because it was so powerful. She tracked it through 2010, and from 1989 to 2010, she found that in 2,281 cases, the stray remarks doctrine had been used to deny plaintiffs' plaintiffs' pleadings in employment cases. So it's kind of remarkable. The next doctrine was this, that, and by the way, these are implicit bias documents that have been used to keep out employment law cases primarily. There may have been a few other, but I don't remember reading any about any others. There's a doctrine called the honest belief doctrine. This was adopted by federal circuits, and it gives approval of implicit bias. The doctrine is totally judicially legislated, as are the stray remarks. Of course, the other doctrine, the same hire, which we'll get to later. This doctrine states, so long as the employer honestly believes in the profit reason, an employee cannot prove pretext, even if the employer's reason in the end is shown to be mistaken, foolish, trivial, or baseless. There's another doctrine which I would like you to take a look at or considering, and the same hire, same fire doctrine. In other words, this says the same person who hired you can fire you with impunity. So the same act of doctrine was adopted by federal courts. And it actually, some of you, if you've done employment law since, say, the 90s, you're very familiar with these cases. But it posits that where the same person hires and fires an employee within a relatively short period of time, the employer is entitled to a strong inference that alleged adverse employment action was not motivated by discriminatory animus. Now, the case actually says within a relatively short period of time. Proud, I think, had been hired for 4 months. And if you've done a lot of employment law, especially in federal cases, you already know that courts have stretched that period out to as long as 6 years. So federal courts have justified stretching out a relatively short period of time, referencing in 4 months, up to 6 years, and in more than one case, up to 4 years. So that's the same hire, same fire doctrine. Okay, I forgot to ask Alex, but I was going to ask him to do a poll, but it's a little late. I'll tell you, I've done about last 2 years, I was approved to be a provider, MCLE provider, but this was in a 1 hour course. And I did about 31 of them, various boards, various places. And I asked them, and I got this from, I think, a British source online. And I asked the lawyers to select your personal assistant. Select who you want your personal assistant just by looking at this picture. And I asked them to, rate them 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. If you look at this picture, I will tell you that in all cases except one, the number 1 choice was A. Okay. I think that's understandable because not only is she white, she's a pretty lady. So I think that's understandable from our, the standards in the country. One case, B was accepted, was selected number 1. And B was always number 1 or number 2. And number 3 was really the clincher for me. Then, number three, I believe I'd have to look at my notes, but I think with the exception of maybe 3 or 4 cases, number C was selected as a third choice. So A was first, B was second, and C was third, which surprised me. And actually, fourth, believe it or not, D was accepted. E was number 5th, and number 6, the last one was the Muslim lady. The Muslim lady was never selected above any level except the, 6th, the last. So, Alex, if we ever do this program again, please remember if we can do a poll. I know that in Zoom there's a poll. I would just like to do a poll to see if it would come out the same way. If we have a larger audience. Usually when I give these presentations, they were usually in smaller offices. Some of them were at boards, maybe 10 of them, 8, 10 of them were at boards, and the rest of them were in smaller offices. Interesting. Okay, understanding bias. I'm not a psychologist, so you know as much about this as I do. My Ph.D. is in political science. Political science does not deal with psychology, we deal with power. So there's a big difference. So, understanding bias, I got this out of a psychology book of some sorts. And I supposed to be explaining unconscious. It was on unconscious bias, which is the same as implicit bias, by the way, just different names. So they say that our brains are used thinking, you can read that biases become wired within the human brain, and this wiring creates a set of systematic error biases. Biases are learned through cultural and experiences. They are contextual. And I think the last one we all understand, but I can take no credit for this one. I found it somewhat believable. Know your own biases. How can I address my biases if I don't even know them? Well, actually, you can't. You have to really address your biases through your behavior. That's how you can address your biases. If you behave a certain way and you keep account of it, most people are totally unaware of what they are saying and when they're discriminating against people. They're totally unaware of it. As a matter of fact, for those who are in the audience who are white people, I don't know if you've experienced this or not, but if you have any black friends, you probably have become so comfortable with them, you make statements that you don't even realize you're making. I have been in the company of white friends that have made statements and talking to me, and they just didn't realize what they were saying. They were so comfortable with me that they just felt that, I guess they just didn't realize what they were saying. So how do you address that? Well, you have to address that if you want to change it. You don't have to take a meat axe and hit them over the head, but there are other ways in which you can address those things when they come up. Most people of goodwill will listen. Those who won't will go maybe to the Capitol and protest. Okay, this is a diversity model, and I didn't invent this one. I think I got this one from some employment source that said that this is the way they are handling it. They have a core values, and they around tolerance, inclusion, acceptance, and that would lead to diversity. All right, how do you handle and how do you handle bias? How do you address implicit bias? And I I am a firm believer that the best way to it is to have organizational values. Now, organizational values, how do you get to those? First of all, organizational values are not the values that an organization can just pull out of context. Organizational values are values that organizations go into committees and they come up with, they brainstorm and they come up with the kind of values they want. I once represented, I think it was a real estate firm, and they were being sued for something or other related to my area of practice employment. And so I think it, and when I say I represented them, I didn't go to court with them. I didn't go to court, but I represented them in the sense that they called me in to do some counseling. And I looked at their organizational values and I said, well, these, you know, where'd you get these? And the owner said, well, you know what, I got those out of some book or something. And I said, well, you know, these are not your values. How did you come by? He said, well, you know, I looked at them. I thought they were nice. So I just listed them as my core values. So that's not the way you come up with organizational values. Organizational values are like the constitution of your organization. You just can't grab a bag and say, okay, you know, I'm going to apply these, because, you know, if you organizational values, you have to look at things like how are we going to put forth our efforts to lessen discrimination, harassment, and the other types of conduct that really impact negatively upon our core values and our organizational and our production. So you have to really, if you're going to have organizational values, and this is for those who own companies and have some influence in companies, you have to have steps by which bias is challenged when it occurs. Whether it occurs in committee, whether it occurs even in offhand statements. And I don't mean policing free speech. I mean just bias that relates to the organization core. So you have to have steps by which you should have steps by which you challenge it. You also, of course, have to create the correct environment, and you do that by organizational values and talking about them to your staff. How you remove negative barriers. A negative barrier, for example, is policing how people wear their hair. I mean, you're not going to have a trial lawyer going in, with dregs, probably, because of the way, she's got to look at the jury. But within your office setting, you have to look at how you are going to remove negative barriers. Whether or not you're going to permit people even to use their own language if they have a language other than English. I suspect in law that won't be a problem because to pass the bar you have to have some understanding of English. And you have to you should have a procedure by which you select new employees. Now, one of the ways in which you select new employees, you make your resumes that are to be submitted, or your CVs, as blindly as you can. In other words, you have your standards. All resumes or all CVs submitted must be submitted with last names only. All resumes that are submitted must be submitted with emails only. All resumes submitted must not have any references to ethnic organizations. You know, and you have to also, now, it depends upon what your organizational value is. If you are a firm that is large and serving the, for example, I guess the Latino community, obviously, you know, you may want to know what language they speak, the potential employees, because if you have an environment like when I was a law student, I clerked for a summer in a law office. The guy had 4 law offices sprinkled around Southern California. All he did was immigration law. Immigration law at that time was, he was Hispanic. He was Hispanic and Filipino. His mom was, I think, Filipino. His dad was Hispanic, Mexican. So he did business with those 2 groups. By and large, he traveled to the Philippines probably almost every month. So if you have an organizational values, you know, obviously they have to be tailored to that particular group because that's who you are dealing with. Even in your hiring, that's just the way it is. I mean, you got to make money. But the idea of reducing organizational bias is to take a chart like this, define what you want, the kind of office you want. You can't do that. The chief can't do this. This has to be done even with the janitorial staff and with everybody coming in and making some contribution to the organization, the formulation of organizational values, because it's the organizational values, if they are adhered to, that will determine whether or not your organization will and can successfully attack some of the harmful indications of bias. Can't attack all of them, but you can attack some of them. And I don't know whether you know it or not, but I don't know how many persons in this group that are from large law offices, but there's a hue and a cry about how many minorities get the hell out of large law firms as quickly as they can because they don't feel wanted in a lot of times, a lot of places. So if you take that back, you got this chart, you take it back and you discuss it with your people, and maybe if they are interested and truly interested in it and want to reduce the organizational bias, they can take a look at it. I think it's one of the more heuristic, more ways in which you can approach addressing implicit bias without jumping down people's throat. Wow, we're at the critique of implicit bias. Before we go into this, Alex, I wonder if we can, can you look at the questions? Do we have any questions, or do we have any?
I don't think we have questions yet.
We're not getting any questions, Lenton. You can keep going. You're doing such a good job. You're answering everybody's questions.
Well, I'm not so sure. I'm not so sure about that. But, I was trying to. So anyway, what are some of the critiques of implicit bias? Okay, This is where I wanted to generate some questions, if anybody had any, because I'll go through this list. And then if this generates any questions, fine. If it's not, I'll go back and we can talk about in depth about some of the cases. So the first critique of implicit bias is really number 2. It's everywhere and it's nowhere at the same time. What I mean by that, I mean that what happens is a lot of people who talk about implicit bias will come out and they will say, well, you know, you can be implicit bias against the color of blue. You can be implicit bias against certain model of car. You can be implicit bias is everywhere, and that's true. And it's nowhere. So the way I've addressed implicit bias and what I've written or spoken about, I've tried to put a handle on it. I've tried to say implicit bias we need to really make it meaningful rather than some sort of psychological test, which is good, but we need to make it meaningful. And we can't make it meaningful if it's everywhere and nowhere at the same time. So my approach has been to let me put a ring on it. Let me look at all of the studies that have been done in this area that tries to put a ring on it. And by the way, there have been some studies done in Canada on the name recognition, primarily of I guess Southeast Asian people, and they have come up with the same results as the Greg and Jamal studies came up with in the United States. It's just that the prejudice or the implicit bias of people in Toronto is much higher than people in Vancouver. And you don't have to be a scientist to understand that Toronto is very close to Detroit. And there, you know, and so the attitudes there are much more, say, prejudiced than they are in Vancouver. In Vancouver, up in Washington, there are not that many Southeast Asians are there. So I think that has some effect on it. But I didn't quote in any of my writings or any of anything here that I'm presenting of that, but it exists apparently in all areas of life in all countries. So the second critique of implicit bias, it, in my opinion, avoids facing racism by softening terminology. In my opinion, there is just no way to confront racism except by directly confronting it. Now, if you're in an environment, a work environment, it's slightly different. It has to be approached in a slightly different way. But as a society, looking at racism, there is no way. And when I mean racism, I mean sexism, and all of the other parts. You just cannot do it. And you see that if you try to soften, for example, what happened on January the 6th. I mean, how can you soften that? And you know, I mean, how can you justify that? And if you listen to what happened, you see a lot of politicians who are spokespeople justifying it, or softening it by saying, oh, well, you know, this time I think we've learned our lesson. You know, bias, and you know, as a political ramification. Employment is different. When you work with people, you know, you have to have a value system and everything, and you need that in society. But what bothers me about implicit bias and people, they want to just kind of circle around racism. I mean, you know, you look at what happened in Washington on January the 6th, and, you know, there you have a sacred location, of course, built by slaves, free labor, but it's our national pride now. It belongs to everybody. And you have people showing up in T-shirts and undershirts with ostrich on it. And you have people showing up with like 6 is not enough or something. I mean, a reference to killing 6 million Jews. I mean, you can't soften that. You know, you have to really face it. It's not implicit. You have to really face it. So my critique of implicit bias is that there's a danger of softening it when it gets into overt racism, overt sexism, overt misogyny. You know, you can't soften that. If it goes that far, then you've got to confront it. And basically, as Colin Powell said about when they had the Iraq War, we're going to catch the snake, and we're going to cut it off by its head. We're going to cut its head off, you know, and that's basically, I think, the way it has to be approached. I don't think you can soften it. Implicit bias in and of itself is a theory. It does not offer any solutions. That was my third critique. And of course, I've tried to put a ring on it myself by looking at it. When I first was introduced to this concept, I thought it was just wonderful. And after a while, you sit back and you say, well, you know what? Nothing is happening here except people are getting together and feeling good. You know, they have these meetings and they feel good. Feeling good is admirable, but it really is not enough. You got to come up with some concrete solutions, in my opinion, if you're going to give implicit bias any air. Now, bias is, I have to compliment the Beverly Hills Bar Association for permitting, for sponsoring these kind of events and these seminars. I see also that at least 1 or 2 others are also going for it. I think there's one on the 29th of January on how lawyers can face their own bias and do something about it. So I think this is wonderful. But in the final analysis, you know, you have to, as we used to say at home, you have to fish or cut bait. The fourth major critique I have of implicit bias is once employers find out about it, they want to take they want to embrace hiring practices indiscriminately. In other words, they look at it and they say, okay, what do I need here? Okay, I got to go out and find me one woman. I got to find me a couple of Asian, a Black, and a couple of Hispanics. You know, the same remedies, it's an injustice to apply the same remedies to different forms of discrimination. And I think that employers ought to face that fact. You know, if you have a board of 12 members or executive board of 12 members that really kind of run the whole corporation or the whole organization, and you can reduce that down to maybe, well, there are 10 of us here and there are 10 executives. And if you look at your board and you have 3 women, 2 Asians, 3 Asians, because one is head of technology, and no Hispanics, no Blacks. I mean, what are you doing? Half of the population almost of California is composed of Hispanics and Blacks. I think it turns out to be about 44, 45%. So you got 10 executives or 10 people who are running the organization, and you know, you are applying a remedy, and that's fine. But my critique is that your implicit bias, or the way you're correcting it, is you're applying remedies that are not correcting it. And I don't mean one for one, but you have to look at what's going on, and that's my major critique of diversity. Diversity tends to say, go out and just find me somebody that don't look like me, and you'll be fine. I think if you want to address the problems in society, you have to address the problems in society. I wanted to tell the audience about the project Implicit Bias. And this is, if you haven't taken this test, this is a test, takes about 10 minutes to take. And it's been developed, first it started with race, but now it's been expanded to females. You can find out, it's a test that shows polar opposites, and you have to select them quickly. It'll show, the polar opposite, like a rose, a bee, black, white, male, female, and it presents, like, for example, it'll show, okay, if you're in the race part where you're showing black and white, they have a black picture, a white picture, and you have to instantly click on which one you favor. And it takes about, like I said, about 10 minutes to take, 10 or 15 minutes, depending on how fast you are and clicking. But it's designed to pick up your implicit bias. And you could take a test to find out whether you are implicitly biased against obese people, for example, people that are, more than fat, obese. So you could take a test to see if you're prejudiced against Hispanic people. I think it's called Latino in there. And obviously against Blacks, and against just a lot of people. It's been expanded. I think over 100 million people have taken the test, and it's been validated, the test. But the test will only tell you who you favor and who you don't favor. And it will pick up your biases. And it's very effective. If you take it, I have the links there. If you take it, be prepared to be surprised. Be prepared to accept the fact that you have some hidden biases, and and also be prepared to accept the fact that you may have some favorite things that you didn't think you favored. So anyway, it's a very revealing test, and if you can't stand honesty, don't take it. But I think everybody would be better off if they could take it. Many institutions, certainly, I think a lot of police, police forces are requiring that their policemen take it. Their new hires take this test. So okay, so I didn't look at the questions. Did you look at the questions? Question and answer. There's one question. Let me see what it says.
Yes, I heard the question. Once people realize they have an unconscious bias that's harmful or negative, how would you suggest that they try to undo or work with that implicit bias? I
Well,
have to
first,
know, we all have implicit bias, don't we, in one form or another, right?
yes, yes. First of all, you know, you have to watch your conduct, because basically your conduct will towards people, and your reaction will tell you. That's the best way you can get at your unconscious bias is your conduct. And once you realize you have it, for example, uh, you know, I've taken these tests, and you know, there are a lot of things that I favor, but one of my negative failure was something that I always realized that I had, but I suppressed it. So, and you know, I'll just tell you what it is. I always realized that I had negative feelings. I didn't feel comfortable around people that are obese, really fat. I just didn't feel comfortable around them if they sat next to me or something like that. And I didn't get up and leave, but I always kind of suppressed it. But I didn't realize that I didn't quite understand it. So I took the test, and it comes out you're extremely negative towards obese people. You know, I had to face that. I had to face the fact that, okay, I'm going to make sure that I don't show that. I don't show it. I'm going to make sure that I fight this, because it's not nice, you know, because, you know, these people are, you know, people, and they deserve respect. They deserve everything. And I looked back in my hiring practice when I had, and I never had any more than 5 or 6 employees. I was never a big firm, but I look back in my employment practice, and I don't think I ever hired anybody that was obese. So, you know, you have to face the fact that, you know, that's who you are, and that's what you are. So you fight your prejudices, not by denying them, but by looking at them and facing them, and examining yourself. I'm not sure whether I'm 100% free of that bias, but I certainly am aware of it, and I will never let it affect my behavior towards obese people again, as long as I live, because it's just not nice, because, you know, they've never done anything to me. It's just that I had that in me, and it may have been inbred, because I flash back when I was younger. I remember people used to make fun of people who are really fat. So maybe I inculcated, I'm from the South, so maybe I inculcated, and that's not saying that the South is the only prejudiced place in the world. It's not. But I inculcated probably some of those beliefs subconsciously, and it did it. So you can take the test, and that's how I confronted mine. And if anybody else Glenn, if you have any additions to make to that about how you've confronted your
that I know that here in Los Angeles we have Museum of Tolerance just south of Beverly Hills. I believe it's on Pico, if I'm not mistaken. And in their opening room, they have 2 doors that you can choose to go through. One says prejudice, and one says not prejudice. And if you try to go through the door that says not prejudice, that door is locked. You can't get in. And the door that says prejudice is the entrance to the rest of the museum. So that tells you something, doesn't it?
Yeah. We all have it, and we all have to find a way of living with that. And I want to make just a point about prejudice versus preferences. If people have, you know, we've all gone through the dating experience, and you know, if people have rejected, if somebody rejects you because they would just not prefer your particular group, that doesn't mean that they're prejudiced, or that doesn't mean that they have implicit bias. It just simply means that they have preferences that are permissible and permitted in society. So, you know, we can always carry things too far. You know, if, you know, people are rejected by a lot of, for a lot of reasons. And a lot of those reasons may not even be implicit bias or explicit bias. They just may be a preference. People may have a preference. I've talked with, I've interviewed a lot of people, and I've spoken with a lot of people in my life. I'm not the youngest person in town. So a lot of times people will tell me that, well, no, I prefer such and such. You know, I prefer, you know, and you know, you talk to them about their personal life. Well, I prefer, you know, I prefer, and African American women are noteworthy about that. They'll say, well, I prefer Black men if I can get one. And then you say, well, why do you prefer Black men if you can get one? Because I just prefer that, and that's the way I would want to raise my kids. And well, are you prejudiced about? No, I'm not prejudiced. You know, I have friends, and so I think we can take things too far, and you know, we can't correct everything, but we can address issues that affect people. You know, that, I mean, it doesn't affect your preferences. Don't keep anybody from being employed. Maybe your prejudices do. My prejudice may have kept me from hiring someone that was extremely obese or extremely overweight, right? My preference for the opposite sex has no bearing on my employment practice, for example, who I hire. So, you know, we have to live and let live, and people have preferences. I mean, you know, yeah, that's just the way life is. I'm told, I've done a little research on dating sites, and some of the dating sites are knocking off that you can specify which race you want to be presented to. But I think the largest one, I think, is Match. I saw an interview by Match. I think Match is the only one that's where a woman is head of it. She may be Asian, I'm not sure. And she says she's going to keep it because she, you know, she's not going to knock that off. And so, because people have a right to have preferences. And I think that's a reasonable approach. You know, I mean, I don't own one of those sites. If I did, I'm not so sure how I would approach it, but I think it's reasonable to say that if you are Persian and you want to date a Persian, you know, and that's your preference, you know. That doesn't mean, I'm sorry.
I just read a very interesting book recently. If anybody's interested, the name escapes me, but it's an analysis from a sociological point of view of political preferences and how it affects our voting patterns, but also our association patterns. Of course, we've seen recently how tribal individuals are, particularly with respect to politics. And it also does affect the people that we will associate with, and much more so. It's increased greatly since around just after World War II, and has gotten even more polarized just on the political factor. So, you know, this is clearly ingrained in our human DNA and our psyche, you know, for millions of years. Obviously, we are tribal beings. And so the question is how you can try to work with that. And I think your point is well taken, you know, from my point of view, that being aware of it and being sensitive to it is, you know, like with many things, psychological, a huge first step in being able to address it. The next question we had is, Lenton, is there a standard definition for diversity? Everyone seems to have a different definition. Let's say you're trying to help Black people, sometimes these terms that I've not heard, POC and BIPOC. I'm not sure what those are, but are interchanged for black. Can you address that question?
I don't know anything about that. I says POC, I guess it's people of color, maybe.
Oh, okay. There you go.
And the other one is what?
BIPOC.
I don't know. I've never heard BIP.
I'm being told it's a black, indigenous, and people of color.
Okay, you got me there. So, okay, that's
The real question was, is there a standard definition of diversity? Does any court decisions or anybody sort of agree on what exactly that means?
As far as I know, there is no standard for diversity. Nor is there a standard. No. Somebody sent me an article, and he was the director of minorities or whatever. The name changes so much, I forget. But he was with one of the 3 top law firms in the United States, if not in the world. And he was he left that firm to go to somewhere else. And I got an article from him, a reference, and he said that, and he defined diversity as being invited, in that article, invited to the party, and inclusion as being invited to the party and being asked to dance. He said the difference between diversity is that you get invited to the party, and the difference and inclusion is that you're asked to dance. So I don't know, maybe some other people have a different viewpoint of it, but to me, diversity, it has its purpose, but you got to be careful when you get to remedies, because if we apply the wrong remedies to situations, you always end up right back where you started, because you haven't really addressed the situation. One of those situations and I may as well let you tell you, because you probably know how I feel if you've ever listened to me on anything. One of those situations is what reparations are due Black people versus other minorities who came to the country since 1960. I mean, there's a book by Doherty is called From Here to Equality, I believe it's called. And that book should be read by everybody. It's From Here to Equality. It's by Darity, D-A-R-I-T-Y. His first name is William. They call him Sonny Darrett. He's out of North Carolina, Duke. I think he's at Duke, North Carolina. Maybe Chapel Hill, somewhere. He's in North Carolina somewhere. But you got to be careful when you address remedies, because you may remedy a situation that doesn't need remedying, just in order to be inclusive. Just say, okay, well, we're going to hire, and you look at this. I've looked at hundreds of websites of law offices, and they brag about how diverse they are, and they don't have a single African American. They have a single African American in their whole employment, and they brag about how diverse they are. So diversity is good. We all like it. I think that we want to be fair, but I think you have to realize that you can't, and we understand this in law. So I don't understand why lawyers are not more active in clarifying things, because one thing we do is we do a lot of thinking. So, as a lawyer, you wouldn't dare apply the same remedy to a guy who is driving on the freeway at 90 miles per hour and gets a ticket as you do as someone who's driving on the freeway at 90 miles an hour and kills somebody negligently. I mean, different remedies, should be applied to different situations. And diversity, there's a danger, but it's there. So anyway.
Well, that's actually a good segue to the next question somebody asked. Do you think big corporations and big law firms will really take the issue of implicit bias seriously now that the term is more visible? Or will they just go through the motions, form a diversity committee, not really make any substantive institutional changes?
I think maybe 5% or 10% will take it seriously and do it. I think the other 90% will take the same way, easy way as human beings normally take. They will, they will make, hire a couple of people here or there, go out and do it. And maybe in the long run, the situation will correct itself. And let me give you an example. When the ethnic studies broke out way back in the 60s and early 70s, it was Black studies, right? And because Blacks were sitting in all over the town, all over the place, closing down places, universities. And so the way they were placated, anybody was hired. Many of the Black studies departments were put together with people who didn't even have degrees. And it took a while. And if you look at the Black studies departments now, for those who don't know it, I do have a university background, and I'm interested in that kind of stuff. If you look at the Black studies departments now and you see them, they have their PhDs from Yale and from Harvard and from Howard and from wherever these top institutions are. And they seem to be, you haven't heard anything from them. They seem to be engaging in scholarly work. They come out with scholarly publications. So there had to be a certain amount of shaking out. But the problem is that you had standing above those Black studies departments, whites who probably applied some pressure in them shaping out and becoming more like the university rather than not unlike the university. And you also had people dying off and coming in and going to these schools like Berkeley and getting degrees and coming back and into those departments. So we're a big country, and a lot of stuff will get shaken out as long as you can avoid the kind of situation that was tried on January the 6th. As long as you can avoid that kind of situation and keep the violence down, a lot of our problems will be shaken out. I doubt if the problem with African Americans will be shaken out without some major infusion of cash in the households departments, because I've lived in all of my adult life practically. I've lived in highly integrated segments. My kids went to school at Esna High School in Huntington Beach, so. So I've lived, and proximity is very important. But the most important thing is that you got to do something about the horrendous historical discrepancy in resources and wealth. Resources, it's like, one person probably said to me, the higher you go, the whiter it gets. And also, the more income you go, the better it gets for Blacks. The more resources they have, the better it gets for Blacks. It's like having a doctor and a lawyer in your family and not having a doctor and a lawyer in your family. If you have a doctor and a lawyer in your family, you can really deflect a lot of the prejudices that get thrown at you if you're Black, or if you have the money to live in the neighborhood. So there are a lot of things that diversity does and implicit bias will do. But in the final analysis, if you want people to be treated equally, they have to have kind of equal, somewhat equal resources. And if you look at African Americans, they're so under-resourced. I think I read one report that says basically for every dollar whites have, Blacks have 2%. That kind of disparity, and I don't know what your the audience's viewpoint is on this, but that kind of disparity has got to be addressed somewhere along the line. And I don't think you can address it with diversity. You can raise the temperature, you can raise the temperature on implicit bias, but in the long run, you know, if you want people to be treated equal, you got to treat them equally. And also, if you want them to be treated equally, you can't have 6% of the, you can't have 6 people in the United States owning more than the entire Black population. I mean, that's just where you are. You know, we can. That's my problem with implicit bias. You can't sugarcoat at rabbit racism. You just can't. You know, I mean, those guys with those shirts on about Auschwitz, which is just run chills up and down my spine to just hear it, just see it. I mean, these people have never been to Auschwitz. They don't know what, I mean, this is, you know, I mean, it's terrible. So anyway, I don't want to, I'm not here to spew my own feelings. So any more questions or anything else out there? Let me.
I don't see any more questions in our Q&A or the chat.
Okay.
If anybody has them, I invite you to put them in now, because we do have a few more minutes allocated to the program. Are there any other resources that you might recommend to some of the folks, Lenton, that they can read up on some of this stuff? I know, if I'm not mistaken, I believe it was the Beverly Hills Bar, but it may have been another organization that just recently did a whole program on the question of reparations, or at least a part of the program on the whole reparations question, which I found fascinating. I'm going to say it was about a month or 2 ago.
Yeah, I did that program. I moderated that program. Yeah, there. The resource that I would recommend for, well, there are a lot of resources that I would recommend for implicit bias, for studying implicit bias, they are really in the lawyers' journals. I find that the lawyers really discuss this issue much better, but there are some other books, and let me just get them. Hold on a minute.
While Dr. Aikins is looking for that, I know there's some seminal articles and information. I believe I'm going to pronounce this correctly. Professor Ta-Nehisi Coates, I believe is his name, who's been
Okay, I'm back. There are some, excuse me. Did I interrupt anybody? I just put on my head. Okay.
I was just.
There are some books. There's a book called Blind Spot. You may want to check that out. There's one called Inclusion, Diversity in the New Workplace. You know, that's a resource that you can take a look at. My favorite book, and I think every American should read this book. I just referenced it, by William Darity, From Here to Equality. It's a new book. That is the, you know, sometimes I get angry at all of the sweat and tears I went through, and then to find out how ignorant I am about issues. I mean, this book, From Here to Eternity, it's subtitled Reparations for Black Americans in the 21st Century. This book, I learned more from reading this book than I did my whole Ph.D. program regarding at USC. Right? So I get angry when I find all the effort that I went through, read all these books and read all these letters by Thomas Jefferson, and read all about how upset Americans were with the Haitian Revolution and how frightened they were that the blacks in this country would revolt like the Haitians did and take over. And you go through all these readings, and then when I was in my PhD program, a lot of truth was denied. For example, if you would mention that Thomas Jefferson had a lot of mulatto kids, half black kids, and if you would present that argument, some professor would grade you down and would tell you, no, that's not true. That's just rumors. so there's a lot. There's a book that was written by Carter, not Jimmy Carter, but this was a founder of Black. I think he's labeled as the founder of Black education, and he has a book called The Miseducation of the Negro. And I don't agree with what it said, because we're talking about things that were written in the 1920s or something. But there's a lot of miseducation in our institutions, and it's better now than it used to be. But I tell you, in order to learn something about our society, you really have to really be skeptical. And I'll just give you one point. I was in the military, and I spent my time in Germany and France. And there was a publication called Stars and Stripes. I don't know if you were in the military, Glenn, or not, but there's a publication. And we would be doing things in the military, and the Stars and Stripes would just print just the opposite. I mean, I learned that you have to take news sources with a grain of salt. You have to really be skeptical of news sources. That doesn't mean you have to be a QAnon person, disciple, but you have to be skeptical of what people are saying and all the things that they're saying, because there's a lot of lying going on out there, and you really have to watch what people are saying, and you have to be incredulous about some of the claims that people are making. And I guess it's a little like Hollywood. A lot of these rumors are circulated sometimes just so people stay in the limelight, I guess. I don't know, but I would say, the more skeptical you are, the more intelligent you will be, and the better off you'll be about believing everything you're told. So that's basically
fine line, isn't it? But currently, with the assaults on mainstream media and just the facts that we've seen recently, it's becoming more and more difficult. What people accept as facts or truth that's written out on the internet can be kind of dicey.
Yeah, facts are facts, and once you get the facts, then if you still don't believe it, then you have a problem. I didn't mean to denigrate the news people, because my viewpoint of that as a political scientist, if we didn't have the First Amendment, we wouldn't be free at all. So First Amendment is much more important than all of the other documents that we have, in my opinion, because if you give air to stench, and you see that in situations where in companies, you give air to stench, then you can cure, or you can attenuate the bad effects of that stench. So free press is just the most important thing that we can have. We can live without. Britain does not have a constitution.
Right, not a written.
But it has free press. So you don't have to have a constitution to have a democracy, but you certainly have to have freedom of speech and free press. So anyway, Alex, how are we on time? I think we're about running out.
Yeah, we've got 5 more minutes. Anybody have another question or comment they'd like to make? Otherwise, I want to thank Dr. Aikins for a tremendous, very, very interesting presentation. We greatly appreciate it. And thank you all for participating in this presentation. We appreciate you coming by. It looks like we had over 60, almost 70 participants at one point. We've got 66 right now. We're showing us online. So that's great participation, and we appreciate it. We're going to be having more programs under the auspices of the mediation section. Again, thanks to Dr. Aikins and my co-chair and program chair, Adam Porter, who's also on for putting this program together, and wishing everybody a safe and healthy and restful weekend. Thank you very much.
Thanks, everybody.